Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the final event of our Fall Author Series here in 2024. My name is Aaron Gurnis. I am your moderator tonight. And tonight, of course, we are super happy to be having Daniel Kraus with us. Just a few housekeeping notes. He will be signing books after the program. So when we're done, he will be going out. There's a little table right by the door when you walk in the gateway. That's where he'll be signing books. So feel free to grab your copies of your books, buy them from Beaverdale Books after the program as well, and he will sign those copies for you. Also, we will be taking audience questions. So at some point, our staff will start collecting them. I have a few questions to start, but then we'll be taking audience questions as well. So all those sheets that were on your seat or on the seat next to you, feel free to grab it, write down your questions. Our staff will walk around and collect them. So with that, let's get underway. Daniel Kraus's latest novel, Paid the Piper, is a supernatural horror story set in a cursed Louisiana bayou where residents have long talked of a murderous swamp entity. When children start going missing, the dark folklore starts feeling real. Kraus, a Fairfield, Iowa native, discovered the manuscript of the story while sifting through the George A. Romero archives at the University of Pittsburgh. He then worked with the Romero estate to bring the horror icon's unfinished masterpiece to publication. Romero is the mind behind influential horror films like Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead, and he helped launch the image of zombies in popular culture. He died in 2017. This was the second unfinished Romero novel Kraus helped bring to life. The first was the zombie thriller The Living Dead, published in 2020. Kraus is also an accomplished writer with bestsellers like Whalefall, The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch, and more under his belt. And he also worked with director Guillermo del Toro to create the idea and story for the Best Picture Oscar-winning film The Shape of Water, and later novelized that story into a best-selling novel. So without further ado, please welcome Daniel Kraus to the stage.
Yes.
There it is. Yep, takes a second. Just takes a second. We're good.
This is only my second event in Iowa ever, despite the fact I grew up.
Well, welcome to everyone. Hey, it's great to have him here in Iowa, right? Woo! Welcome back. So this book, Pay the Piper, your name underneath George A. Romero's name for the second time on a book. Does it feel a little surreal still?
Yeah, it does. It's the most surreal thing I've ever been part of. There it falls. just like my career, inevitably.
I was going to say, just like the children in the story.
I should have said that.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I shouldn't have touched it. Now it's just going to, let's see, I think I got it. There we go. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, Romero was my favorite artist of any medium. I started watching Night of the Living Dead when I was 5 years old on a show that played, at least in Fairfield, it probably played all over the Midwest. It was called Saturday Nightmares. It was like, it was like a Svengoolie, like a horror type, but there was no host. That was its fatal flaw. But it was on for like 10 years, and they would just play movies. Because Night of the Living Dead was in the public domain, they always played it. So I saw it a million times growing up. And yeah, he was my favorite artist. I wouldn't be doing anything without him. Him and Rod Serling, I discovered around the same time. My mom was just a fan of horror. And those two people were kind of like, kind of surrogate dad figures who kind of shepherded me over the decades. So yeah, it still kind of blows my mind that I could be involved with his stuff, because his stuff meant so much to me.
I mean, he's known for, obviously, zombie films, but what are some other deeper cuts maybe that you're a fan of, if people are out there wanting to watch some other Romero film that they haven't yet?
Well, I mean, he never made a bad movie. His favorite movie was Martin, which is a low-budget vampire movie that's just tremendous. He did a really bizarre film called Night Riders, which is like King Arthur told through Renaissance fair troupe who, instead of horses, they ride motorcycles. It's so bizarre, but there's nothing else like it. It's a true original. And then he's got one that I really like that was only rediscovered a few years ago called The Amusement Park. But yeah, I mean, all of his movies are good.
And so you're a big Romero fan, and you eventually get to work with his estate. But how does that relationship get built to the point where you're helping create The Living Dead in 2020?
I mean, it's still kind of a mystery to me. I'd only met Romero once, and it wasn't a business meeting. You know, I just met him socially once, and we hung out for about an hour or so. And that was 10 years before he died. And then a few weeks after he died, his wife and manager called me and said, look, he was working on this book for years and years, and wanted to know if I would take a stab at finishing it. So the question is, why me? All I can say is that his manager knew that I was a big student of his, and I think I must have impressed him with the fact that it wasn't just his zombie movies. Like, that's pretty much what most people talk about. But I knew his other movies very well. And I think I had just come off doing 2 books with Guillermo del Toro. So two projects with him. And so I think I was in the ether of being someone who could collaborate efficiently.
Yeah, maybe Guillermo put in some good words to you for the estate.
It's always possible.
So he's a filmmaker, Romero. Obviously, like he's made a lot of art, but like primarily a filmmaker, and you've become primarily an author. So in what way does his imagery and his creation of film kind of impact the way that you write and the way that you style your work?
The way I do?
Yeah. What influence has it had, I guess?
I don't know that, like, I mean, it's just the ideas. I don't know that if his movies had been books, I don't know that they would have impacted me that differently. I think the big difference was just that I wasn't going to read a George Romero novel at 5 years old, but I was going to see the movie. So I think that medium bleeds through earlier, because you can't read a book when you can't read that level of books, but movies can kind of wash over you, and you can sort of understand it or not, or take certain things from it. And we all have examples of things we saw as a kid that weren't even horror movies, but just scared the crap out of you, or had some sort of weird impact on you. So movies have a weird, more nebulous power to sort of seep into you. But really, it was, again, that aside, I think it was really his stories and his use of metaphor. Like, he really taught me what metaphor was. Once I sort of understood. I mean, years down the road, when I finally saw like Dawn of the Dead, like I started to understand what art was, and I think he was the first creator that I ever tried to connect with the art piece. Because you're a kid, you're also not thinking about who's making these things. There's just a movie on, and there's names, but there's just a bunch of names. The first person would have been Rod Serling, because he actually appeared on screen in the Twilight Zone. Every episode, he'd come out with a cigarette, and you'd say, okay, that's the guy. This is his show. So everything beyond that was a harder connection, I think. But yeah, so I think his ideas have influenced me at every stage. And the mark of a great works of art is that they change with you. The movie that I saw, the Night of the Living Dead movie that I saw at age 5, was not the same one I saw at age 10 or age 20. You start things that you laughed at before suddenly aren't funny at all, or vice versa. So yeah, I mean, there's no way he hasn't influenced me.
So let's talk about this book, Pay the Piper. It came together a little bit different than The Living Dead, the first one that you had, because this book, from what I understand, it was a full manuscript, or just about, that was found in the archives. So can you talk about the story, getting the call, figuring out how this comes together? Yeah,
so this was, by all indications, this was a secret project. Really, nobody knew about it. The Living Dead was a book that he had talked about for years. So everyone who was a super fan was kind of aware it was something he was working on. This came out of the blue. Like, when I found it in the envelopes, it was just sort of like, what is this? His wife hadn't heard about it. Nobody had really heard about it. And he was a real binge writer. where he would just, write almost without sleep for days, and and then collapse, and then not write for a while. So the entire manuscript for this, for all I know, was just the product of a couple weeks of like madcap writing. I mean, I don't really know, but it's my speculation. And then he stops like practically right in the middle of a paragraph. And it's about half the book. So he wrote about half this book, but not in the exact form that is in this book. With a living co-author, you can kind of volley things back and forth. You can try new things. You can write new pages. He wasn't there to do that on either book, so I took it very seriously, trying to maintain what I could from his writing. So even if it didn't work where he put it, I would try to move it somewhere else and have it work over there, or combine two characters into one, or find some way to hold on to as much prose of his as possible. I thought this book would be a lot easier than The Living Dead, because The Living Dead is a huge, like gigantic tome, and this seemed to be a regular-sized book. And I was like, after that, I got this. Of course, never say that. This one ended up being way harder, partially because it's not part of an established universe. Like Living Dead, he had made 6 zombie films, and I sort of understood them, what he was getting at with them. With this, this was clearly reading his manuscript, the book he wanted to write. Like this one had no zombies. He was frustrated with zombies. He felt hemmed in, penned in, pigeonholed by zombies. Was thankful for them, but couldn't get anything else made. This is just filled with all of his eccentric enthusiasm. It's a real Cajun gumbo, so to speak, of just like all the things he liked, which are largely the enthusiasms of a boy who grew up in the 1950s. It's got like elements of westerns and like jungle adventures and buried treasure and pirates, and it's all these things that don't make any sense together. And that was part of the problem, is he was weaving these great scenes and great characters, and sort of in this ever widening view of this town, and then just stops with no notes about where to go.
So it stops literally just halfway, though, and you're
Just
you're trying to figure out not just like the way to piece this together, but also the resolution.
Yeah, and so it was such a strange book filled with so many strange elements.
And to anyone that hasn't read it, it's kind of a Pied Piper story set in the deep Louisiana bayou is kind of the elevator pitch for it, I guess, but maybe you could describe it a little bit better.
Yeah, it has...
creepier than that, I'd say, even.
And like all of his stuff, there's that's what he was mostly known for, is making movies that seemed like horror movies, but were about a lot more what was going on in the world, more specifically America. And this book has a lot of that. It's sort of undergirded by the real life story, the real life travails, sins, if you want, of the pirates Lafitte, who are these real life pirates who kind of America's most famous pirates, who worked down in New Orleans, trading everything, gold, people. They were just terrible, terrible people. And the Piper, what they, at least at the beginning of the book, what they call this entity, is more or less getting revenge upon the descendants of the pirates Lafitte, who populate this little bayou town. So there's a lot going on in the book, and to figure out how to thread together all those elements was just really, really difficult. It was one of the most difficult things I've had to do in like 30 books. Like I would try it and it wouldn't work, and I would try it again. And really what saved it was just going into deep research mode into things he had written that stuck out as particularly peculiar, and researching those. And sometimes in that research I would find nothing, but sometimes in the research I would make great discovery.
What's an example of that? Like maybe was the octopus part of that? There's octopus symbology all over this place. Obviously, I imagine you grew up in Iowa. You're in Chicago now. You're not super familiar necessarily with the deep bayou, but the atmosphere of this book is you can just feel the humidity dripping off the pages. So, and it seems like research is something that you really enjoy doing.
Yeah, I do tons of research, and a lot of my books do take place in Iowa. This one could not be more different. But he had clearly done his research, and although I've spent some time in New Orleans, I hadn't really spent any time in the deep bayou. So I did go down there, and then visited like the site of the Battle of New Orleans, which is kind of if you're in Louisiana, you know what that is. So the question was an example.
Some of the research, yeah.
So my favorite example of this is there's a character in the book that's obsessed with John Wayne. And that wasn't that surprising because Romero did really love Westerns. But still, the amount of John Wayne in this felt weird to me. And in particular, he spent, in the original manuscript, it's the weirdest thing I've ever seen in a piece of writing. He spent 40 pages recounting the plot of a movie, or an obscure John Wayne movie called Wake of the Red Witch, which isn't a Western, by the way. It's kind of a pirate movie. So there was the first connection. I was like, all right, so if you spent 40 pages talking about this film, there's got to be something important here. So I acquired the film, I watched it several times, and sure enough, you start picking out little things, like little details, like town names and character names, and you start connecting them. And anyway, so I started reading John Wayne biographies. And this is no small feat because they're huge. At the end of the second biography I read, and John Wayne's dying of cancer. And of course, John Wayne, as we know today, is a kind of a problematic dude. And we get into that in the book too. But the way he stood for something in America that isn't really what America was is part of the themes of this story. But anyway, at the end of one of these John Wayne biographies, a discovery that just chilled my blood, but it was exciting too. So he's dying, and he says to his faithful secretary, the Red Witch finally got me. And he called his cancer the Red Witch, named after this movie, Wake of the Red Witch. And that was just like head blowing up emoji. Like, it's like, oh, this book's about cancer. You know, like, that's why so a lot of the book is about cancer. And sure enough, there were people in the book, sort of in the manuscript you had written, who were dying of cancer, and it all started to come together. So that's one example of a few where the research really paid off.
You're really kind of like an amateur sleuth. You could write your own little novel, it seems like, about you being an amateur sleuth trying to solve the puzzle of this book.
That's what was so difficult about it, because it was like half writing and half like archaeology, and finding out like what were the signposts that he left in here that would have been like super obvious had he been here, and I could just say, what's up with all the Red Witch stuff?
Yeah.
Just tell me instead of having to read 8,000 pages. But yes, so it took a while, but we got through it.
Well, now, of course, Romero isn't the only famous filmmaker whose work you've been a part of. You also were a big part of The Shape of Water. It was, I was reading a story about, and you had told me earlier in the podcast we did, that it was an idea that you had, and you were working with Guillermo del Toro on Troll Hunters, which is a kids show on Netflix, and from a novel that you had written. But you were just working with him, and then you said something, and there's a spark happened, basically. So can you tell a little bit of that story?
Sure.
I mean, it's an Academy Award-winning movie. It's got to be crazy that you to think about that it all came from that conversation.
It's all very weird. It was an idea I had when I was in elementary school. So Pence Elementary in Fairfield, Iowa.
You got to clap over there.
Oh, really? Well, when I was there, at some point, I saw Creatures from the Black Lagoon, which is probably on Saturday Nightmares. And And I just kind of thought the Creature from Black Lagoon got a raw deal. Like, it was my favorite of the Universal monsters, the creature. And like, he's just sort of chilling down there in the jungle, and these dudes in boats come down and start messing with him and shooting him and poisoning his lake. And it was like, man, that sucks. And I had this little idea of him being taken to a lab, and the janitor kind of like starting a relationship with him and breaking him out and putting him in her tub. That was the whole idea. And I carried that idea with me for decades.
I think I said there's like a story where you literally just had it jotted down in a little black book that you carried around. Like,
yeah, I mean, I have my little idea books, and I would, you know, when I get finished with a run out of space, I sort of draft over at the beginning of the book all my kind of my story ideas, and I'd always draft that one over, but never really broke apart in my head. And then when we were, you know, when I was having breakfast with Guillermo one day, it just came up. Somehow Creature of the Black Lagoon came up. I said, oh, I've got a take on that I've been trying to crack all these years. And I told him, and he was like, I love it. That's it. That's my next movie.
You're like, yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, it wasn't. It was, he went on to make Pacific Rim. I don't know. No, he did Crimson Peak next, so it actually wasn't his next movie. But anyway, so yeah, he did end up making it, and it was good. Yeah, it was a trip. I was at the Oscars. It was weird.
I was gonna say you got to know an executive producer or an assistant producer line or something on that. That's pretty crazy. And did you get to hold the statue?
I've never held the statue.
Got to call Guillermo up and see if you can hold one of those.
Yeah.
So you've worked with him on that, A Living Creator, then obviously you and him helped shape the novelization of that movie. I guess what's the difference in kind of, you know, you talked about a little bit, but like working with someone, a creative partner like this, that's a live you can bounce ideas of, versus, as you kind of talked about, working with these manuscripts, these notes, these short stories that George Romero left behind, and what are some advantages and disadvantages, I guess, to try to recreate stories from someone that has passed away?
There's almost no advantages to the, you would think in a way that it would be, because you don't have someone pushing against you. You know, there's any collaboration, there's always a little bit of friction, but that's good. That's part of why you do it. You want to force yourself to write in new ways and stuff. But it's much worse not having them there at all. Because, I mean, at least if you're me and you have great respect for the person, as I did Romero. I mean, if it was just Joe Blow, I would just steamroll all of his stuff and just write whatever I wanted. But instead, you have to play the other role too. You have to say, I want to do this. Would he be okay with that? And then it's like boxing yourself. Like you want to sort of protect the other person.
Do you find yourself doing that? Like, did you have an alpha reader or an editor go through some of these Romero books, and like, were you finding yourself protecting like Romero's like lines or something like that when an editor's like, does that make sense?
A little bit. Generally we all want, whether he was with us or not, we all would have been working towards trying to make the best book possible. So there were a few scenes in The Living Dead, and of course, you know, it was a giant book, so some stuff needed to be cut anyway. There were a couple scenes that I was sad to see go, but I knew the editor was right, that they didn't need to be there in this book that was already 700 pages or whatever. Like, but yeah, even those I was sad to see go, but I knew it was for the best.
No, The Living Dead was notes and a short story, is that right, pretty much?
No.
How did The Living Dead, like, and what were the differences between Pay the Piper and Living Dead in recreating that?
Pay the Piper was very straightforward in the sense that it was half a book, and that's it. Living Dead was much weirder in the sense that he had tried the book over the years 2 different times. So there were 2 different versions that were similar in some ways, but quite different in others. And both of them petered out at some point. Both of them he stopped. And they were also weird in the sense that they weren't just like the first half of books. They were gaps. And then there was like, you know, pieces that clearly belonged at the end and pieces that were somewhere in the middle. And then he did have some notes on some of the plot threads, but not others. so it was like a whole bunch of islands that I needed to build bridges between, and then fill in a bunch of stuff. So it was structurally way more complicated, but easier in the sense that I had a much more natural grasp of what the story was.
Yeah, you're almost like, like creating it in your own way as well. Yeah,
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason these aren't ghostwritten.
Yeah.
Both our names are on there because in neither case was there enough from him to
Sure.
that it was going to have to be half me.
Before we get to audience questions, I do want to talk about one book that is 100% new, and that's Whalefall. I mean, how many people here have read Whalefall, out of curiosity? Yes, we got a good amount in here. That book, it's being optioned into a movie. We actually talked about this a little bit beforehand, so you might see, I don't know how these things work, but a trailer sometime in 2025 or something like that, or 2026. But it sounds like good progress is being made on it, and of course it's for sale over there at the table, so if you haven't read it, it is such a unique and I think specific book. Give us the elevator pitch, I guess. How would you elevator pitch Whalefall?
One thing I've always appreciated about Whalefall, it's one of the few books that I can elevator pitch. Instead of just rambling incoherently for 10 minutes. It's about a diver who gets swallowed by a whale and has 1 hour of air to try to get out. That's the elevator pitch. But slightly further, it's entirely scientifically accurate. So I worked with diving experts and whale experts. So everything in the book, while highly unlikely, could happen. It's like if you were to get swallowed, and you could if it was a sperm whale. Most whales have tiny little throats, but some whales have giant throats. Everything in there has been vetted, like it could happen.
Well, I think that's interesting though, because you talk about the research that you did for Pay the Piper, and then also, you read Whalefall, and you can tell. You talked about how if it was Joe Schmo, you could write whatever and mail it in. And this book, you could write a story like this where you kind of mail it in. You kind of write a whale adventure. You say, oh, he got swallowed, and then don't worry about the science of it, just kind of like the air and everything. But you're talking about larynxes, you're talking about the 4 chambers of the stomach and the specific things that are going on in that. So I really like, what inspires you to do this kind of research on this stuff, to get it right like this?
Mostly what inspires everything that I do is not wanting to get stuck writing the same things over and over. So about halfway through my career, about 10 books into my career or whatever, I just had this sudden concern that I was going to start writing books that felt like my other books. And I really wanted to keep things fresh. So every time I write a book now, I try to write something that's completely different, has a whole new set of challenges, and that forces me to relearn how to write a book. So I can't use my old methods. And so for Whalefall, the challenge was, I don't know anything about whales. Was not good if you're writing a book.
Well, why did you want to even write a book about whales then?
Well, because when I thought of the premise, I thought this is the greatest idea I'll ever have.
And the premise came, you saw a story, right? A news story?
Yeah, there's like various viral videos you've seen of people who the headlines always say swallowed, but they're never swallowed. They're mouthed, which is not good. That's still bad. But they're usually humpback whales. You can't be swallowed by them. But I hadn't seen the video. I just heard people talking about it, and I got my brain thinking. And there's biblical stories. There's Pinocchio. There's like these sort of abstract, fantastical versions of this. But what appealed to me was, could you do it realistically? Because nobody, I looked, the very next morning I looked and said, has anyone done this before? Has anyone tried to do this in a way that was like scientifically valid? And no, and so then within the day, I was on the phone with whale experts, just trying to figure out, could this happen?
Or the whale experts were like immediately receptive to your ideas.
They were immediately excited.
You're like, someone wants to write about us.
Yeah, I think, I worked with 3 in particular throughout the whole project. And they were always enthused, they were always so excited about it. I think because they knew whales, the insides of whales so well but they never thought about it from this angle. And so I think it was fun for them to rethink their careers in a way. Like, I was asking questions that never get asked of them. I was like, well, what does it smell like? How hot is it in there? Is it sticky? Could you turn around? You know, just all these like things that were like, huh. And you know, what was so different for me is that typically I'm coming up with a story, then I kind of research a bit and an alternation or whatever. But in this one, I couldn't possibly begin to plot it because I don't know anything. I don't know how big it is, how small it is. So I had to front load the whole process with about 3 months of just talking to the experts and doing interviews and figuring out what was even possible, starting from zero. It was like I had a little flashlight almost and was like pointing at things in the stomach. I was like, what's that? What happens if I tug on that? You know, just like this arduously slow learning process of figuring out what was in there. And along the way through these conversations, the plot developed, or the sequence of events developed. And one nice thing about the movie is that it's got to hew close to the book because you can't do anything else. I cover everything you could possibly do.
It's kind of like what are they, like those bottle episodes of a TV show or something? Everything takes place. I mean, almost the whole thing takes place within a whale, basically. So
yeah. So I mean, there's if you haven't read it, there's it jumps back and forth between inside the whale and kind of flashbacks. So there's some like breathing room where you go back.
No pun intended.
Yeah.
Well, this person wants to know if you're surprised that it was made into a movie. Like,
yeah, I certainly didn't.
You didn't, because I always thought it seemed a little cinematic myself, the countdown and stuff. But obviously, you seemed like you were stunned that someone wanted to option it.
No, I mean most of my books have been optioned for movies and TV at some point, and then, you know, same as everyone else, they hardly ever get made. This was not one that I really saw being a property people would be super interested in for movies because it seemed like so difficult. Like whale stomachs, for those of you who haven't read it, it's like being in a elastic sleeping bag. It's very quite tight. It's like, well, no one's gonna want it. That's it. How could you make a movie out of that? So I was very surprised when lots of people wanted to make a movie about that. So you just can't predict really what's gonna hit.
We were talking before the show, that is the biggest hang-up right now as things are kind of getting into the schedules, literally just figuring out how to film inside a whale.
We're right now, in fact, I have a Zoom with the movie people tonight at 10 p.m. because Weta Workshop is in New Zealand and they're building the stomach. So every time we do a Zoom, it's at weird hours. So I got to be back in my hotel room at 10. It's really neat though to see how I'm going to tell you virtually nothing, but it is neat to see how people who build sets like this, and even they have never built a living set before, one that breathes and moves. How quickly you give them a week and they come back with like, here's how we're going to do it, and it's like, oh yeah, that's way simpler than I would have guessed.
All right, so we got some more listener questions here, audience questions. This person says, you've written books that are both categorized as middle grade and young adult. How do you feel the ideas or execution necessarily for that differ from your adult work, or does it really differ all that much at all?
The middle grade differs.
Yeah.
Like, you know, most of my first several books were released as young adult. That was kind of by accident almost. Like my first book was purchased as young adult, which I didn't realize that it was. And then kind of how typical publishing contracts work, your editor has the right to look at your next book first. And she just kept buying them. So it's like, I was like, all right, I mean, publish them wherever you want. There's not a lot of difference between my adult and young adult. Today, it's increasingly, because now I basically write just adult. Increasingly, as I get weirder and weirder with how my prose, it's probably less likely that it could have been published as young adult. But most of, if you're an adult and you like my books, you can read the young adult, and they're pretty much the same. Middle grade is different. You've got a different vocabulary you have to deal with.
Is that challenging to go down to that vocabulary, or
No, I didn't find it that challenging. I mean, everything's challenging, but not in the sense that the challenge wasn't changing the pitch of or the tone. Really, I'm not really concerned about disturbing kids. I have a middle grade series called the Teddy Saga, which involves teddy bears, which might be the most disturbing thing I've ever written. But that's, I don't know, sorry, kids. I would have loved to read that stuff as a kid, and I read all sorts of, adult stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, like your first couple of books, you didn't necessarily pitch them as YA, but they're kind of about younger boys or the teenage boys or something like that, and some of the main characters, and that was just kind of like, it's funny how a publisher can just kind of like, oh, we can slap a different kind of cover on this and market it slightly differently.
Yeah, and I just didn't concern myself with it much. Like, just sort of like, my books were being put up at Random House. I didn't care. It's like, put them out however you want. Just let me keep writing them,
This audience member wants to know if you have any thoughts or ideas on this book. I'm assuming it's Pay the Piper becoming a movie, and I don't know how you feel about like maybe either of those Romero books that you've helped co-written, if like someone was interested in.
Yeah, there's definitely been some interest. Like I said, there always is.
Yeah.
Living Dead's hard. In like a post-Walking Dead world, it's hard because Living Dead's so big to launch another gigantic zombie thing. So that one's kind of tough. This one would adapt very nicely, but I have no shareable news on that.
Gotcha. Do you feel that after working on a couple of these Romero books, that your house style, your Kraus style, quote unquote, has kind of absorbed some of his prose, maybe more so than just watching his movies growing up?
No, I don't think so. I think my prose was developed enough by the time I started messing with his, that it was sort of Teflon coated. I don't think there's too much that will affect the way I write in the future. It continues to be really his ideas, and his methods. Like, just to pick a random example, something that impressed me at 5 years old with Night of the Living Dead, and still impressed me with the characters in this book, was just he has this habit of putting words of wisdom into the mouths of the villains. I just find that so interesting. He seems so willing to make his protagonists, his heroes, if you want to call them that, do terrible things, and have his villains sometimes say really smart things, or even occasionally be heroic themselves. And that kind of like mash of like disregard of good versus evil is really, it has informed everything that I do. As I've said many times, I have no interest in good versus evil. It's boring to me. What I find interesting is bad versus worse. Like that's where it gets interesting. How bad is too bad? How far can I go with a character and still maintain you liking them? Like, those are the kind of battles that I found interesting.
One thing we actually didn't talk about that I kind of want to pick up on it, talking about your writing and your style, quote unquote. What is your history with writing? I mean, you were watching movies growing up, you said. Obviously, you had a book where you kept ideas, but I think you were writing stories as a kid, and like your first book, when was it published? I guess just like, how did you become the author now that you are today, where you have more than 20 books published?
I mean, I started writing in like first grade at Penn. Outside of school, there wasn't back then. There wasn't really. I don't remember a whole lot of like free writing or sort of creative writing. I'm sure there was some, but I was just writing it as my neighborhood friend Ben and I would draw monsters, sort of like Godzilla type monsters. And eventually we wanted something to do with the monsters. We would write, this monster fights this monster, and there were just pow, pow, it's just like fights. And eventually he stopped writing, but I kept going. And then by middle school, I was writing what you would call like novellas. And in middle school, I had one class where, which I think was pretty radical at the time. It was like the first like free writing class, like creative writing class. And all the seats were in a circle, and that was like, what? You put seats in a circle? Like it was crazy. And again, that was like, I had a lot of fun in that class, but I used the class as almost like a workshop for my weird ideas, and I was doing all my serious work at home. Like that's where I was. Once I was in high school, I was writing like novel length stuff. And I think this is key, I think, to how I've approached my career. I never showed it to anyone. Like, but today it's like almost too easy, I think, to show your writing to other people. Like there's so many ways to do it now. But back then, not only were there not ways to do it, it didn't even occur to me. So I'd write these things that I would spend months and months on, finish it, and be like, all right, and I put it in a drawer, and that was it. I think that really trained me to not be real concerned about external reactions. Like I rarely read reviews. Like it's just like it's fine when a book comes out, but it's not of that much interest to me. It's the writing that I'm really excited about, so I'm basically still doing what I was doing in Fairfield, which is I'm writing because I love to write. I would write 7 days a week if I could. I wrote 7 days a week for many years, and now I've agreed to take off Sundays. But I just love writing so much, and I think that's because that's how I programmed myself, is to love writing and to not really care about the external stuff.
Does it ever surprise you that people like your writing as much as you like your writing?
Well, yeah. I mean, they don't always. We mentioned all my, some of my greatest hits, but I've got my greatest flops too. But again, I don't care that much. Like, I really like them, and if you don't, I don't follow reviews very much. I certainly don't follow sales. I have no idea how many money my books have sold. The slightest idea. I just know that sometimes checks show up, which means, okay, that book is doing okay. Sometimes checks don't show up, and I was like, well, that book must have flopped. But I don't really care because I'm on to 5 more books since then.
I do think, looking at your page, you have 20 books, but you look at the publishers too. There's all sorts of different publishers in there. You're finding different people, different audiences for your work. It really, like you said, the process is probably more important to you than the result, but you're able to get these works out there too, which is pretty cool and pretty prolific, I think.
Yeah, I've moved around a lot. I've been kind of restless in that way. If I've been at a publisher for a while, I get itchy, and yeah, it's going okay, but what about that publisher over there? I can work with somebody new, and that'd be exciting. And so I bounced around a lot, and occasionally I do think I'm famous last words. I'm trying to slow down a bit because there were a couple years where I would have like 5 books out, which was like they were very different. There'd be one for kids, one for adult, and maybe a graphic novel and whatever. But that's getting on the border of being too much, where I would almost have to pick winners and losers. Like I can't support this many books. I can't do appearances for this many books. I have to choose which one I'm not going to give my time to, and that's not good. So I need to slow down a little bit, and I'm trying.
So you've collaborated with 2 legends, one living, one passed away, in Del Toro and Romero. Do you have any collaborations in your future or any dream collaborations that you'd like to do?
I mean, never say never, but I would like to be done with them. I just have so many of my own stories that I want to tell, and at some point you realize the clock is ticking and you're not going to get to them all. Of course, there are some people in the world who, like, they called me up. It would be hard to say no, but there have been people who have called me up and I have said no. So I doubt I'll do any more, but you never know.
This person said that when you're writing Whalefall, you actually learned to scuba dive. Is that right?
Well, I mean, yeah, I scuba dived once.
Once.
Mostly just to feel it, like feel what the suit felt like, how heavy it was, what did it smell like, what did it sound like when you're breathing underwater. Like, I scuba dive, but I'm not a scuba diver.
Have you done any other method writing techniques they would like to know? Which, I mean, some of their books where people are getting killed and stuff, I don't know if that's the best you can quite do that, but...
I don't know. I mean, I always, if possible, I try to visit locations. If it's...
Did you go to Louisiana for the Romero book?
Yeah. If it's a book set in Iowa, I grew up here, so I don't need to go there. But if it's set anywhere else, like I traveled out to where the exact beach where Whalefall takes place, and really wanted to be present at a whale dissection. But the only way you can do that is when whales beach, and then a kind of like bat signal goes out to all the whale experts in the region, and they come there, but you have to have certain certification. So I just literally wasn't legally allowed to. So yeah, I don't know what else to say except for, I try to go to the places. Sometimes, and this isn't exactly what you're asking, but what I do a lot is I will impose restrictions on myself. Like, as I was saying, I try to like write in ways that I haven't before. So for like my book Blood Sugar, for various reasons, I wanted to get rid of most of the punctuation I would normally use. Like I said, no colons, no dashes, just periods, no quotation marks. Like there's a reason for it, but because that forces you to do things different. You find yourself stopping every sentence, saying, "Oh, I can't write this sentence like I normally would." I just finished a book that's all one sentence. The entire book is one sentence. And there's a thematic reason for that in the book, but like that was really exciting. Like, okay, this feels like nothing else I've written before. I can't use periods like I normally do, and that changes the whole feel of the book, and it changes how you're writing, and it just disrupts you in every way, but in a really exciting way.
And we're gonna have a couple more questions here. One, just generally about horror. What do you think it is that people like about horror, the genre, whether it be books, whether it be movies, TV? What is it that people glom onto? Because I feel like it is a very hate-love relationship for some people. Some people can't watch it at all, and and there's different kinds of horror too, which I know we've talked about in the past too.
If you want to lose 2/3 of the readers, all you have to do is say, "I write horror," and like they'll be like, "Oh, well, I won't read that." So that's a given. And considering how few people actually read, now you've chomped it down to like a little sliver. I don't know. I mean, I think everyone gets from it something different. I know when I was growing up, and when horror was the most important to me, was probably in like the middle school age, which were, of course, the worst years of my life. But despite what was happening at school, despite the bullies or the anxieties and all that, at home, I was renting the hardest horror stuff that the video store had. And it felt like I was toughening myself up. Like I might be a victim all day, but they couldn't watch the things I watched. So to me, it was almost like it felt like a training or an armor in some way. Societally, I don't really know. I mean, there's lots of people who talk about horror has a boom whenever there's something sort of globally going on that's horrific, but I feel like there's always something horrific going on, so I'm not sure how. I think it's probably, I'm maybe cynical, but I feel like it's just more just sort of money-based. It's sort of like you get something that makes a lot of money, and suddenly everyone wants that. Stranger Things comes out and makes a lot of money, and then suddenly horror's big. Well, yeah, it's because everyone's now funding things that they think will make a lot of money. So I think the peaks in horror, a lot of it is just financial.
What misconceptions do you think readers have about horror that maybe they would read that they don't realize? I don't know. Like, do you think there are misconceptions out there about the genre that people?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, some people think horror and they just think, oh, I don't want to read something that's gory. Most horror is not gory. Some of it is, but there's like all sorts of like light, cozy horror, and there's Victorian haunted houses, and there's just any genre. Any fan, if you're a romance reader, you know that people's perception of romances is incorrect. And there's this huge span of what they are. It's the same in any genre.
All right, last question, and I want to talk about what I saw on your Instagram account a couple days ago when you released the title of your newest book, or you announced the release date of your newest book, Angel Down. I'm just going to read the pitch from the Instagram caption. A polyphonic tale of moral conflict. 5 World War I grunts find a downed angel. Greed takes hold, and their angelic counter becomes a descent into hell. That seems pretty heavy, and you seem very excited to be announcing this project. Is this something that has been bouncing around in your head for a while?
Yeah, this is one. I mean, some ideas I literally carry, as a Shape of Water, carry around for decades. This one's not that old, but it's probably 5 or 6 or 7 years. I've been sort of toying around with the idea in my head. Of a war novel, basically. So in this case, World War I, and there's these sort of the inglorious grunts of this. The 5 worst soldiers in this division are left behind when the division moves to essentially go out and euthanize a soldier who's out in no man's land and is caught on barbed wire and is screaming. This happened all the time. But when they go out there, what they find is an angel. World War I was really the advent of modern war. And so we were shooting further and higher than anyone ever had before. So in this sort of, what if the angels thought they were safe up there? So they come across an angel who's lying in the barbed wire. And this angel, of course, being an angel, has all sorts of abilities to do miraculous things, could end the war maybe. But the soldiers start kind of infighting. Like, all of them want something different from the angel. So with this thing that could be this heavenly, miraculous event starts becoming something hellish as they sort of start tearing each other apart over ownership over what to do with this thing.
And if it's as well researched as a lot of your other novels, World War I is one of my favorite, well, not favorite, but I think it's a very interesting part of history that gets a little overlooked by the historical fiction society. So that's going to be July 29th, 2025. But of course, you can pay the piper and Whalefall over there. Daniel's going to be signing books here, and we are going to be wrapping up. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us up here. Thanks for coming.